Okay, folks, in the last video, we came up with the aggregate expenditures curve. And guess what? We figured out where that nice little handy dandy Keynesian cross was, and we figured out where the nation's product market is in equilibrium. Now, if you don't remember where that's at, that's where the national input or the national income will equal the national output. So the aggregate expenditures, it will cross that Keynesian curve, and that Keynesian curve, that Keynesian line. Okay, folks, in that last video, we talked about the aggregate expenditures curve. And specifically, we talked about the Keynesian cross, where we talked about finding that equilibrium of the nation's product market. That point where the aggregate output will also equal the aggregate expenditures. And that can be found in that Keynesian cross. Now, whenever we're talking about that Keynesian cross, here it is graphically again. We have that 45-degree ray showing where at each one of these points aggregate output equals aggregate expenditures, and so on and so forth. And we also have where one of these aggregate expenditure curves crosses that Keynesian cross, so that's where that nation is going to be in equilibrium of their product market. And if you remember, we know these are aggregate expenditure curves because we're dealing with consumption plus investment plus government. But why do we have three of them? Why are there three of these aggregate expenditure curves? I thought a nation just had one aggregate expenditure curve. Well, they do. Right until the term of you start dealing with changes in real wealth, which we're about to cover here in a second. But what we're going to do is we're going to first and foremost start talking about and defining what the aggregate demand curve is. So the aggregate demand curve is the demand curve for the whole entire nation. What is the demand curve for basically all products within an entire nation among all of the consumers? What is the demand curve of all products within a macroeconomy? So what the demand curve really shows is it shows a relationship between the amount that is being demanded, the amount of products, the amount of output that's going to be demanded within the United States or within a macroeconomy at alternate prices. So what if prices change? And whenever we talk about these alternate prices, we're going to talk about the general price level within this particular macroeconomy. So now we did talk about there being three of these aggregate expenditure curves. And now where do they come from? Well, you see, the aggregate expenditure curve is going to depend upon the consumption expenditures. Now, these consumption expenditures, how much a household is going to consume and how much they're going to spend on different products, well, that actually relates to their real wealth, how much they have in real wealth. So if you remember back, whenever we were talking about the consumption expenditures and shifting that consumption line, we said, well, if real wealth is going up or if the wealth of a person is going up, well, they might be willing to spend more. Well, the same thing applies here. So, but we also define it by talking about the real wealth, specifically that real wealth. And now, if you remember back from chapter, I believe it was chapter 2, where we're talking about real versus nominal. You see, real wealth is going to be the current wealth or the nominal wealth that has been adjusted for inflation. So it's attacking or it's looking at the purchasing power of wealth. How much can you afford at the current general price level? So let's go ahead, and I know this may not make much sense right now, but hopefully by the end of this video it will. As I'm saying it, I'm kind of seeing that not everything is lining up right in the video, but let's go ahead and go through the whole video and maybe it'll begin to make sense. So first and foremost, whenever we look at this graph, we have our aggregate expenditures over here and our aggregate output down here. We have our nice little 45-degree ray for our Keynesian cross. And then we have these three lines, these three different aggregate expenditure lines. As you can see right here, we have this nice little C1, C2, and C3, meaning we're dealing with three different consumption, planned consumption functions. But you also see that investment and government spending will remain the same across these three. Well, that's because earlier in the chapter, we said that government expenditures are going to remain the same and investment expenditures are remaining the same. To where whenever we're dealing with this, we're dealing with just changes in consumption expenditures, which is what we're saying here. These changes are in response to consumption expenditures. So what's causing consumption expenditure to change? Consumption expenditure is changing due to the changes in real wealth or the purchasing power of that wealth. So whenever we're starting to talk about this purchasing power of wealth, imagine this. Imagine that you have a $100 budget per month to buy beef. Hey, yay, steaks. We're going to buy steaks with this, right? So let's say that you have $100 a month that you can buy steaks with. Now let's assume that the steaks that you're getting, they only cost $10 a pound. So how many pounds of beef can you get? Well, if we do the math real quick, 100 divided by 10, you can buy 10 pounds of beef with that $100. Now, your income doesn't change. Nothing really changes except for the price of beef now goes up. The general price level of beef now increases to $20. Just the sheer price increases to $20 a pound. Now how much beef can you get? Oh no, the price went up, you can only buy 5 pounds. So the general price level went up, and now the amount that you could buy, that purchasing power, fell from 10 pounds down to 5 pounds. So here we had a change in our real wealth. Our real wealth fell because we can't buy as much. Now our nominal wealth, our current income, hey, that didn't change. But the amount that we could buy with that current income did. So now we have a decrease in the amount that we could buy. So our purchasing power fell. Now, assume that the general price level falls to just 5 pounds. Now guess what? You can buy 20 pounds worth of beef. So that means that our purchasing power, our real wealth just increased. Because even though our wealth didn't change, the amount that we could buy has now gone up. So equate that to the amount that we're going to consume, to this consumption expenditures. What if our prices increase? The general price level increases. Well, now we're not going to be buying as much, right? Our output will fall if the general prices increase. Does that make sense? Well, yeah. So let's look over here at this graph. And we're going to basically start using aspects of this graph and bringing it into this one. So over here on this graph, we're starting to develop this aggregate demand curve where we have aggregate output down here. What's the total amount of output that we're going to produce, the nation's output, right? And we're going to compare that to the price. So right here we had a price level of P1, and we were going to be able to consume right down here at this Y1. So what we find is that at a price level of 1, we do have this much output that occurs in the United States, and we know that because of this Keynesian cross, that nation's equilibrium. Seeing how we're starting to bring some of this all in together. Now, what if prices fall? They fall to P2. Just kind of like what happened here. Prices fell from $10 down to $5. Well, if your purchasing power of that real wealth, that purchasing power of that wealth increases, meaning you can buy more physical goods with the same amount of money, guess what happens? Our output increases from Y1 to Y2, and our equilibrium now increases. So that's seen here where it kind of looks a little bit weird, but we're actually seeing that aggregate exponential curve shifts upward, meaning that our equilibrium now shifts outward and to the right, which means that, well, what has happened? Well, the price level fell, meaning our real wealth has increased, allowing us to purchase more at this lower price. Now, what if prices go up by that same token? Prices now increase. Well, we see that purchasing power, just like what happened here, that purchasing power fell, meaning we can't buy as much. because of an increase in price, we see that our output will actually fall. Our aggregate output will actually fall. So what we're doing right down here is this, what we're talking about right now is all being described down here. Whereas at P1, our aggregate, our equilibrium is at E1. Versus if prices fall to P2, prices go down, equilibrium expands E2. Guess what? The nation is now selling more goods. Prices rise to P3, equilibrium increases, or equilibrium will actually fall, prices go up, and aggregate output actually falls. Which all that makes sense, especially whenever you're considering this is a demand curve. And with the demand curve, as prices increase, the amount that you're looking to buy, that quantity, will actually begin to fall, which is exactly what we're seeing here. Prices are going up, quantity is falling. And why is that happening on the aggregate? And it's happening because something like right here, where the general price level increases, was decreasing our real wealth, meaning we can't buy as much. So as the general price level increases, we don't buy as much because our real wealth is falling. And because the real wealth is falling, it is lowering that aggregate expenditures curve and just tying it back in where our aggregate output will begin to fall. So this is how we're going to begin to develop this aggregate demand curve for the whole nation. And it's based off of that very simple principle that as prices rise, you buy less. As prices fall, you buy more. You have more money to spend. So this aggregate demand curve shows us the combination of prices and output on the whole for the whole nation, and that helps us to develop that demand curve. We find that demand curve is downward sloping, and that we can see that because that curve is downward sloping, meaning that as prices go up, the aggregate output will begin to fall. Or as prices go down, aggregate output increases, which makes sense. Prices fall, you buy more. Prices rise, you buy less. And that is true whether it's an individual or across a whole nation.